The iPod Touch 5th generation was announced along with the iPhone 5 and brought all eyes on the iPod Touch for the last time. It was revamped with a new 4-inch display as well as a new thinner design. This iPod Touch only lasted for so long, but the aluminum design is still used on the current iPod Touch. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we are going to be looking at my iPod Touch 5th generation still running iOS 6. Let's first talk about what this iPod is all about. This iPod was initially sold back in 2012 for $299, which you might say is a little much for an iPod Touch now. Apple is selling its latest iPod Touch for just $199, and the reason for that is because people don't really buy the iPod Touch anymore. In fact, at least with the last two iPod Touches, Apple actually didn't announce them, they quietly released them. So it is really just for your kid who may not be old enough to have a phone yet. I have never owned an iPod as a kid. I used an iPad 1, which was shared with the family before getting my own iPad that I used for a couple of years. You technically can still buy an iPod Touch 5th generation on Apple's website as a refurbished product, but spoiler alert, you're gonna get ripped off. When iOS 7 came out, Apple did get rid of the slate black color and replaced it with their space gray color. They also did that with their iPad Mini 1 and iPod Nano and Shuffle, but they still have the 5 other colors including blue, pink, red, gold, and white. You also see the little button on the bottom left of the iPod that you could put their so-called iPod loop on it. Now you can really put anything on here. It can just be a piece of string if you really wanted to. They also updated the iPod Loop black color to a more gray look as well when iOS 7 came out. My iPod didn't ship with the iPod Loop, and I don't really care. In fact, Apple didn't care either, and the 6th generation iPod Touch removed the iPod Loop feature. You can also see that the Apple logo as well as the word iPod is in the middle, and all iPods had that, but it also looks like the current iPhone, just without the wording on it. You also now have metal buttons rather than the gummy rubber ones. Although Apple did have an iPod Touch 5 that did have rubber buttons, it also only had the front-facing camera on it as well. Weird. You also have the new lightning jack, which was the first iPod to have one along with the Nano. You also see that the jacks are black with the iPod as well, although Apple could have made them white to make them pop. You also have the camera and flash at the top, which we'll get more into later. And the only other thing is the home button and the front-facing camera. The iPod Touch 5th generation was released with the A5 chip as well as 512 megabytes of RAM. So it's basically an iPhone 4S in a thin but taller aluminum body. That means that the iPod Touch does run pretty good on iOS 6 and terrible on iOS 9. But the iPhone 5 runs iOS 6 better because of the A6 chip and the 1GB of RAM anyway. The iPod Touch also got a little bit better battery as well as a little bit better of a camera. The iPod is also first to be equipped with a gyroscope and I think an accelerometer. The camera on this iPod Touch 5th gen is a 5 megapixel rear camera, which is considered eyesight for Apple, but it's way better than the puny 0.7 megapixel rear camera on the last iPod Touch 4. Just so you know, the rear camera on the iPod Touch 4 as well as the iPad 2 is worse than the camera on the original iPhone released in 2007. I'll show you a few pictures as well as a video I took on my iPod right now. Sorry, I only have one picture of outside, but you get the point. Going back, you also have a flash on the iPod Touch for the first time, which I guess is useful if you want to find that remote beside your bed. The 4-inch display is just like the one on the iPhone 5 with a 16:9 ratio at a resolution of 1136 by 640 pixels, which is 326 pixels per inch. I don't know how many units of this iPod Touch were sold, but it was one of the top iPod Touches ever sold. This iPod uses the same design as most of the iPads, which makes the iPod lean more toward an iPad-y feel, but at the same time it's way more like a phone just because it's smaller. So going to my iPod Touch, I bought this iPod way back in July for $75 US. It was from a guy who lived in Colorado, and because of that it shipped to my house in just a few days. Now I have the footage of myself unboxing this because I did it back in July of last year. Looking at this iPod, it is in fact running iOS 6.1.3, and no, it is not dual booted, nor is it jailbroken. This iPod Touch was built on March 9th of 2013, and the latest version of iOS at the time was iOS 6.1.2. When it was purchased on July 5th, the latest was 6.1.3. So I am convinced that this iPod may have not been updated at all, and iOS 6.1.3 was released on March 13th, which is only a few days apart from the manufacturing date of this iPod as estimated. The iPod Touch running iOS 6 feels pretty smooth and does daily tasks pretty well without getting real hot or draining the battery. This iPod can't really do much anymore no matter what version you're running on than just the necessary tasks. Although you do have Siri for the first time, so you can tell her whatever you want. In the meantime, you could download old versions of apps, and that's what I've done here, but some things might not work. It can play games pretty okay since they've advertised the iPod to do that well, but really, you should use an iPod Touch this old as a sick music player. Since I'm running iOS 6, I have Overflow, and it has enough storage for me at least to put whatever I want on it, and a sync. I just use any old lightning cable that I have sitting around, and I can use the headphone jack to my advantage. Since this iPod has Bluetooth, I can connect my AirPods to it, but it sometimes likes to disconnect after going to the lock screen of the iPod. But that's probably because it's equipped with an older Bluetooth module. In the end, the iPod Touch 5th generation is probably one of the best iPod Touches released, not only because of its design, but also the features that came with it. And if we take the CPU, GPU, and RAM out of the picture, I think this is the most sophisticated that the iPod Touch will ever get. And I think people are happy about that. There really isn't anything that needs to happen to the iPod Touch anymore. Still, I think Apple should still sell it though. It's great for kids to have and suitable in use in business applications. And for this iPod Touch, I think I'll be keeping it around for a long time. It is my main MP3 player kind of thing, and I really like the cover flow and the skeuomorphic design. So that's all I have for you guys in this video. Consider liking this video and subscribe if you like what you see. Also, make sure that you check out my Instagram at alumnitech47 because that's also cool too. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.